Hey friends, and welcome back to my channel. I want to start this video off with a strong warning. This video does have themes of SA and could potentially be really triggering to some viewers, so please watch this at your own discretion, and if you aren't able to watch this week's video, then that's completely fine, no worries, and I hope to see you in my next one. Before we jump into the details of the case, if you haven't already, please make sure you hit the like and subscribe button. It will really help my channel and help to motivate me into making these videos, and of course it will be super appreciated. So the subject of today's video is the 1991 kidnapping of the then 11-year-old Jaycee Lee Dugard. Prior to her kidnapping in 1991, Jaycee's family actually lived in LA, but they decided they would move to Myers in September of 1990 because they figured that it would be a safer community for Jaycee to grow up in. Her family consisted of her mother Terry and her half-sister Shayna and her stepfather Carl. And Jaycee's biological father actually had no idea that she existed at this time, so he was nowhere in the picture. Growing up, Jaycee was very close to her mother and to her half-sister, but wasn't that close to her stepfather. And before the abduction in 1991, Jaycee had a fairly normal and happy upbringing. At the time of her abduction, Jaycee was in the 5th grade, and her friends and family would describe her to be someone who is very polite, very quiet, and very shy. She was so shy that on the day of her abduction, Jaycee was actually stressing out about an upcoming field trip she was meant to be taking because of how shy she was. So the day of Jaycee's abduction would take place on June 10th of 1991. On this particular day, Jaycee's mother had woken up early and she worked as a typesetter at a print house, so she left the house really early to go to work. However, Jaycee's stepfather was home that morning and he was there to say goodbye to Jaycee as she left the house and walked over to the bus stop that was nearby. And shortly after Jaycee begins walking to her bus stop, a gray car slowly approaches her and stops. Jaycee, thinking that the driver was probably just stopping to ask her for directions, also stops walking and watches as a man begins to roll down the window. Before she even has enough time to say anything to the man or to react, the man pulls out a taser and stuns her. There was also a second person in the car who would quickly pop out as Jaycee was stunned, grabs Jaycee, pulls her into the car, and then the car just drives off. The man in the car was Philip Garrido, and the second person in the car was his wife, Nancy. What's really shocking about this abduction is that it happened in broad daylight in front of several of Jaycee's classmates and even in front of Carl, who's at this point still at home. Carl was actually in his garage and he saw all of this happening through the window of the garage. And when he did see it happen, he immediately jumped onto his bicycle and tried to chase down the vehicle. But unfortunately, because he was on a bicycle and the abductors were in a proper car, he wasn't able to overtake the vehicle and he would unfortunately soon lose sight of the vehicle. Carl did call the authorities right away and a search was initiated. The FBI even got involved and the search included search dogs, aircrafts, hundreds of law enforcement personnel, but unfortunately the missing girl couldn't be located. When I was doing research on them, I was pretty shocked to find out some of the information that I did on this couple, primarily on Philip's history. Apparently, Philip had been accused of SA, domestic violence, and even kidnapping before, so this definitely wasn't his first time around the block, if you know what I mean. He's also been arrested a few times for assault and for masturbating in a car by the side of an elementary school. And in 1976, a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation diagnosed Philip as a sexual deviant and a chronic drug abuser. According to Philip's dad, Philip wasn't always this troubled. He was actually a pretty normal and very good boy growing up, but that apparently all changed radically when he had a serious motorcycle accident when he was a teenager. After this accident happened, Philip turned to serious drugs and his personality just changed and he became an entirely different person. Philip and Nancy apparently met when Philip was serving time in the late 1970s. Nancy was at the prison that Philip was being held at and she was there to visit her uncle, but somehow she saw Philip, and I guess he saw her, and they became instantly attracted to one another, and they started a relationship while Philip was in jail. The two started dating briefly after that meeting, and in 1981 Nancy and Philip would end up getting married while Philip was still in jail. When Philip and Nancy got married, I believe that Philip had been in jail for about 4 years, and he had another 7 years to serve, I believe, because he had a 11-year sentence. So he was actually let out on parole in 1988. So after the couple had kidnapped JC, they would drive 3 hours up to a town called Antioch, which was about 120 miles away from where they had picked up JC. And it was in this town that JC would be forced to live in a shack in the backyard of her abuser's home for 18 years. Throughout those 18 years, JC went through things that no human being should ever have to go through. Nancy and Philip had renamed JC, and they gave her the name of Alyssa. She was told that her family didn't want her anymore and that nobody loved her anymore, and that's the reason why she was here. She was handcuffed and locked in a shack during her captivity, and she was horribly abused. The only people she ever really got to interact with were Philip and Nancy, and she was pretty much cut off entirely from the rest of the world. And what's really horrible is that JC was regularly assaulted by Philip and eventually would fall pregnant with his child. So at age 14, JC had to give birth to her first daughter with Philip, and then at the age of 17, so 3 years later, she had to give birth to a second daughter. Both of JC's daughters were raised to call Nancy and Philip their mom and dad, and to believe that JC was not their mother, but in fact was their older sister. JC wrote frequently in a journal that she had, where she would document her deep depression and fear and loneliness and feelings of being unloved. She was constantly wondering if her family were still thinking of her, if they were even out there looking for her, or if they even loved her. She didn't have any idea that there were still searches going on for her and that her family hadn't given up on her. And at some point, because she was so lonely and so depressed and didn't get to really interact with anybody, she even grew to cherish the human interaction that she would have with Philip and Nancy. I think this is also one of the reasons that she stopped thinking about escaping. It had been so long since she was kidnapped. She didn't know how to leave, and after all the lies that Philip and Nancy fed her about her own family, she really didn't believe that there was anywhere for her to escape to. So in a way, I think JC really just embraced the fact that this was just going to be her life now. She didn't think about escaping anymore. She was just going to stay here, live in this person's backyard, and just continue living this way. However, on August 24th of 2009, Philip would go to visit the campus of UC Berkeley, and he would bring 2 of his daughters with him, so the daughters that he shared with JC. Philip had wanted to visit the campus because he and Nancy were very religious, and they wanted to hold some sort of religious event on the campus. And during this visit, Philip had met with the university's special events manager, who thought that Philip's behavior was quite off. So he actually contacted the campus security to ask them to do a background check on Philip. During this background check, the campus police noticed that Philip had been previously convicted of sex crimes, and they were immediately concerned because here Philip was with 2 young girls. So they contacted his parole officer and expressed their concerns. The parole officer was immediately concerned because this officer has been visiting Philip's house regularly for several years now and had no idea that Philip had children. That same week, Philip was called in for a meeting with his parole officer, and he would end up going, and he would bring his wife, Nancy, he would bring his 2 daughters, and he would bring JC, who was going under the name of Alyssa. And Philip insisted to the parole officer that Alyssa and the 2 young daughters were just his relatives. And during the questioning, JC even backed up Philip's story and insisted that they were relatives and her name was Alyssa. She also told the parole officer that while Philip may have been a convicted sex offender in the past, he had definitely changed his ways. Eventually, after further questioning, Philip did break down, and he did admit to the parole officer that he had kidnapped and assaulted Alyssa and that Alyssa's name wasn't Alyssa, it was actually Jaycee Lee Dugard. Investigators believe that Jaycee may have experienced Stockholm Syndrome during her period of captivity, and that was why she initially tried to protect Philip and had tried to back up his story. And honestly, to me, that makes total sense. And a part of me wonders whether or not she would have revealed her true identity to the parole officer at some point if Philip hadn't broken down. She had been through so much trauma up to this point, and she truly felt alone and scared and had no idea what was going to happen to her. So it's completely understandable why she felt this need to protect her abuser and to play it safe when faced with all these questions. So on August 26th of 2009, Philip and Nancy would be charged with 29 felony counts, including the R word, which I don't think I can say on YouTube because I don't think it's like allowed, and false imprisonment. And soon after, Jaycee and her family discovered that due to Philip's failed parole supervision, the state of California would be rewarding her with $20 million. In the end, Philip would receive 431 years to life in prison since he was already a registered sex offender before the kidnapping. However, Nancy only has to serve 36 years, which I think is completely absurd because Nancy was 100% also entirely at fault for all of this. She helped kidnap Jaycee, she helped keep Jaycee in captivity, and she helped to mistreat Jaycee. And apparently Nancy wasn't super happy about having to share Philip with Jaycee, so oftentimes she would lash out Jaycee because of her jealousy. So I'm just really shocked that she's only getting 36 years. I think she should spend the rest of her life in prison because there is something wrong with somebody who can do this to another human being, especially a child. But since she was rescued, Jaycee has published 2 books about her life and what she went through, and now she lives a really private life with her 2 daughters. This was probably one of the toughest cases I've had to research and talk about. What Jaycee went through is just beyond words. Like it's really shocking. She's had so much taken away from her and so many horrible things done to her. She had 18 years of her life taken away from her. 18 years without her family, without being surrounded by the people that she loves and who loved her, without being able to go to school and have a normal life. Like, that's just so sad. And it's just really amazing and inspiring how resilient she is and how resilient she remains. Apparently, when Jaycee was still in captivity and as she and her daughters were growing older, she set up a little school in the backyard near her shack where she would teach them as much as she could with her 5th grade education. She really loved her daughters and wanted to help them as best as she could. Even to this day, she continues to protect the privacy of her children and said that even some of their friends don't know what they went through. And in one of the few interviews that Jaycee's done, she was asked whether she would be okay if her daughters would ever want to visit their dad in prison. And while she said that she doesn't like thinking about that, or she doesn't love the idea of her kids visiting Philip, she wouldn't stop them if they really wanted to get to know their dad and to visit him. She said that she would respect that decision and she would support it. She might not like it, but she will definitely support it because she's not gonna hold her daughters back from getting to know who their father is if that's something they really wanted. And when I heard that, I thought to myself, like, wow, that is an incredibly strong individual. If I was in a similar situation, I don't think that I would have that same mindset. So I really admire how strong she is to be able to think that way. And yeah, that brings this video to a close, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in into this week's video. If you guys like my content, please don't forget to click like and subscribe. And I look forward to seeing you guys in my next video. Thank you guys. Have a good day. Bye.